The phone call that would shatter Robert Kellerman's world came at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He was reviewing quarterly investment reports in his study when his estate attorney's voice cut through the autumn silence like a blade. What Margaret Chen told him about his daughter's recent outburst would change everything he thought he knew about family, legacy, and the price of unconditional love. The words his daughter had screamed still echoed in his mind as he realized what he had to do next. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Robert Kellerman had spent 68 years building what most would consider a perfect life. His fingers drummed against the mahogany surface of his antique desk as he stared out at the rolling hills of his Sonoma County estate. The vineyards stretched endlessly toward the horizon, their leaves turning brilliant shades of amber and crimson in the October light. This was his sanctuary, his achievement, his legacy. 43 years of careful investments, strategic business decisions, and relentless dedication had created an empire worth $37 million. The call from Margaret Chen should have been routine. His estate attorney typically contacted him quarterly to discuss portfolio adjustments, tax implications, and the various charitable foundations he supported. But her voice carried an unusual tension that immediately put him on alert. Margaret had been handling his legal affairs for over 20 decades. She was not prone to dramatics or unnecessary urgency. Her words came in measured, professional tones, but the content was anything but professional. She had received a disturbing phone call from someone claiming to represent his daughter Caroline. The caller had demanded information about Robert's will, his assets, and specifically whether Caroline remained the primary beneficiary of his estate. When Margaret had declined to provide such confidential information, the caller had become increasingly aggressive. But that wasn't the worst part. Margaret's voice dropped lower as she continued. The caller had eventually revealed themselves to be Caroline herself, speaking from what sounded like a bar or restaurant based on the background noise. She had been drinking, Margaret suspected, based on her slurred speech and increasingly erratic behavior. During their conversation, Caroline had launched into a bitter tirade about her father's perceived failures as a parent. Robert's hands tightened around the phone as Margaret recounted the conversation. Caroline had accused him of being emotionally absent throughout her childhood, of prioritizing his business ventures over his family, of never truly understanding or supporting her dreams. The accusations weren't entirely new. They had surfaced during various family arguments over the years, particularly after her mother Diana's death 5 years earlier. But then Caroline had said something that crossed every line of decency and respect. In a moment of pure, venomous rage, she had screamed into the phone that she wished Robert had never been born. She wished he had died instead of her mother. She wished she had never been burdened with a father who cared more about money than his own child's happiness. Margaret's professional composure had cracked slightly as she delivered this information. Even she, who had witnessed decades of family disputes and estate battles, seemed shaken by the raw hatred in Caroline's voice. She had immediately ended the call and contacted Robert, knowing that such a revelation would require immediate attention and careful consideration. Robert set down the phone and walked to his study window. The view that usually brought him peace now felt like a mockery. Every vine, every acre, every carefully cultivated row represented years of sacrifice and dedication. He had built this empire not for himself, but for Caroline. Every missed soccer game, every postponed vacation, every late night at the office had been justified by his vision of leaving her financially secure and independent. The irony was devastating. Caroline had accused him of caring more about money than family, but everything he had built was intended as an expression of love. His wealth was meant to be her freedom. His success was designed to be her security. His legacy was crafted to be her foundation for whatever dreams she chose to pursue. But clearly she saw it differently. To Caroline, his achievements represented neglect. His dedication to building wealth symbolized emotional abandonment. His careful planning for her future felt like manipulation and control. Robert's mind drifted back to Caroline's childhood. Had he really been such a terrible father? He remembered working long hours, yes, but he also remembered birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations to Europe and the Caribbean. He had attended her graduation ceremonies, helped her through college, supported her various career changes even when he privately questioned her choices. Perhaps he hadn't been emotionally demonstrative in the way Diana had been. Perhaps his expressions of love had been more practical than verbal. But he had always believed that providing security and opportunity was a profound form of caring. Apparently, Caroline disagreed. The study door opened quietly, and Maria Santos entered with a tea service. She had been Robert's housekeeper and companion for the past 3 years, ever since Diana's passing had left him rattling around the enormous house alone. Maria was in her early 50s, with kind eyes and intuitive understanding of when he needed solitude versus gentle company. She set the tea tray on the small table near his reading chair and studied his expression with concern. Maria had never met Caroline directly, but she had witnessed the aftermath of their increasingly strained phone conversations. She had seen how each interaction left Robert more confused and hurt. Maria poured the tea without speaking, allowing Robert to process whatever news had obviously disturbed him. She had learned to read his moods expertly. Today's expression was different from his usual post-Caroline melancholy. The study door opened quietly, and Maria Santos entered with a tea service. She had been Robert's housekeeper and companion for the past 3 years, ever since Diana's passing had left him rattling around the enormous house alone. Maria was in her early 50s, with kind eyes and intuitive understanding of when he needed solitude versus gentle company. She set the tea tray on the small table near his reading chair and studied his expression with concern. Maria had never met Caroline directly, but she had witnessed the aftermath of their increasingly strained phone conversations. She had seen how each interaction left Robert more confused and hurt. Maria poured the tea without speaking, allowing Robert to process whatever news had obviously disturbed him. She had learned to read his moods expertly. Today's expression was different from his usual post-Caroline melancholy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Today, he looked devastated, but also resolute, as if he had reached some kind of decision. Robert accepted the tea gratefully and settled into his leather armchair. The warmth of the cup against his palms was comforting, grounding him in the present moment rather than the painful memories Margaret's call had stirred up. He had always prided himself on being a rational, logical man. Emotional decisions were dangerous in business, and he had trained himself to step back from immediate reactions and consider long-term consequences. But Caroline's words had cut deeper than any business setback or financial loss. They had attacked the very core of his identity as a father and provider. If she truly believed he had been a burden rather than a blessing in her life, then perhaps it was time to reevaluate everything he had assumed about their relationship. Maria settled into the chair across from him, her presence both respectful and supportive. She didn't pry into his affairs, but she had become skilled at offering comfort without requiring explanations. Robert appreciated her discretion more than she probably realized. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the study. Robert's eyes moved from the vineyard view to the photographs lining his bookshelves. There were pictures of Caroline at every stage of her life: baby photos, school portraits, graduation ceremonies, family vacations. In many of them, she was smiling. Had those smiles been genuine, or had she been performing even then? He thought about her recent years since Diana's death. Caroline had moved to Portland ostensibly to pursue her passion for sustainable architecture. She had started her own firm with a focus on environmentally conscious design. Robert had been proud of her initiative and had even offered financial support, which she had declined somewhat coldly. Their relationship had grown increasingly distant since Diana's funeral. Caroline seemed to blame him somehow for her mother's cancer, as if his presence had been toxic rather than supportive during Diana's final months. She had made several cutting remarks about how Diana had always been the real parent, while Robert had been merely a financial provider. Now, with Margaret's revelation fresh in his mind, Robert wondered if Caroline's resentment ran even deeper than he had realized. Perhaps she saw him not just as an inadequate father, but as an actual impediment to her happiness. Perhaps she viewed his continued existence as a burden rather than a gift. The thought was so painful that Robert had to set down his teacup to steady his hands. How had they reached this point? When had love transformed into hatred? When had his efforts to provide and protect become interpreted as neglect and control? Robert's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen, hoping irrationally that it might be Caroline reaching out to apologize or explain. Instead, it was his financial advisor confirming their meeting for the following week to review year-end tax strategies. The timing felt surreal. Here he was, planning financial maneuvers to preserve wealth for a daughter who apparently wished he had never existed. Maria seemed to sense his distress and quietly refilled his teacup. Her gentle presence was exactly what he needed at that moment. Unlike Caroline, Maria appreciated his efforts to create a comfortable, secure environment. She understood that his attention to practical details was an expression of care rather than coldness. The contrast was striking and painful. Maria, who had known him for only 3 years, seemed to understand his character better than Caroline, whom he had loved and supported for 34 years. Maria saw his provision of employment, housing, and stability as generous gestures. Caroline saw similar efforts as manipulation and control. As evening approached, Robert made a decision that would have seemed impossible that morning. He walked to his desk and pulled out a legal pad, beginning to draft notes for a conversation he needed to have with Margaret Chen. If Caroline truly wished he had never been born, then perhaps it was time to grant her wish in the only way he could. He would not simply disinherit her entirely. That would be cruel and vindictive, and Robert was neither cruel nor vindictive by nature. But he would restructure his estate in a way that reflected Caroline's apparent desire for independence from his influence. If she found his presence burdensome, then she would no longer need to bear that burden. The plan that began forming in his mind was both elegant and devastating. He would leave Caroline exactly what she seemed to want: freedom from any obligation to remember him fondly or feel grateful for his efforts. She would receive a modest inheritance, enough to ensure basic security, but not enough to feel burdened by his legacy. The bulk of his estate would go to causes and people who actually appreciated his contributions. Maria noticed him writing and quietly withdrew, sensing that he needed privacy for whatever decision he was making. Her intuitive respect for his boundaries was yet another contrast to Caroline's increasing demands for emotional accessibility that he somehow never managed to provide correctly. Robert spent the next 2 hours outlining his thoughts, considering the implications of various approaches to restructuring his will. He thought about the charities he supported, the scholarship funds he had established, the environmental conservation projects that aligned with values Diana had instilled in him. Perhaps these causes would be more deserving recipients of his life's work than a daughter who viewed his efforts as burdensome. The wine country evening was crisp and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Robert's study felt like a cocoon of warm light and leather-bound security. This room had been his refuge during the worst periods of Diana's illness, his sanctuary for processing grief after her death, his command center for managing the complexities of significant wealth. Now it was becoming the place where he would fundamentally alter the legacy he had spent decades building. The decision felt both heartbreaking and liberating. If Caroline wanted to be free of his influence, then she would get exactly that. The plan that began forming in his mind was both elegant and devastating. He would leave Caroline exactly what she seemed to want: freedom from any obligation to remember him fondly or feel grateful for his efforts. She would receive a modest inheritance, enough to ensure basic security, but not enough to feel burdened by his legacy. The bulk of his estate would go to causes and people who actually appreciated his contributions. Maria noticed him writing and quietly withdrew, sensing that he needed privacy for whatever decision he was making. Her intuitive respect for his boundaries was yet another contrast to Caroline's increasing demands for emotional accessibility that he somehow never managed to provide correctly. Robert spent the next 2 hours outlining his thoughts, considering the implications of various approaches to restructuring his will. He thought about the charities he supported, the scholarship funds he had established, the environmental conservation projects that aligned with values Diana had instilled in him. Perhaps these causes would be more deserving recipients of his life's work than a daughter who viewed his efforts as burdensome. The wine country evening was crisp and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Robert's study felt like a cocoon of warm light and leather-bound security. This room had been his refuge during the worst periods of Diana's illness, his sanctuary for processing grief after her death, his command center for managing the complexities of significant wealth. Now it was becoming the place where he would fundamentally alter the legacy he had spent decades building. The decision felt both heartbreaking and liberating. If Caroline wanted to be free of his influence, then she would get exactly that. Robert's thoughts turned to Diana and what she would think of this situation. Diana had always been the emotional translator between him and Caroline, helping them understand each other's very different languages of love and care. Without Diana's mediation, their relationship had deteriorated into misunderstanding and resentment. But Diana had also been realistic about Caroline's character. She had worried privately about their daughter's tendency towards self-centeredness and ingratitude. Diana had tried to help Caroline appreciate Robert's quieter forms of devotion, but those efforts had only been partially successful even when Diana was alive. Would Diana approve of his decision to restructure his estate? Robert wasn't certain, but he suspected she would understand his reasoning. Diana had always believed that people should face the consequences of their choices. If Caroline chose to reject his love and legacy, then she should experience what life would be like without them. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, reminding Robert that the day was nearly over. He had begun the morning as a father planning to leave everything to his only child. He was ending it as a man preparing to demonstrate that words have consequences and relationships require mutual respect. Tomorrow he would call Margaret Chen and begin the formal process of restructuring his will. Tonight he would sit in his study and grieve for the relationship he had thought he had with his daughter and for the legacy he had thought he was building for her future. The irony was profound and painful. Caroline had accused him of caring more about money than family. Now, because of her words, she would discover what it truly meant to receive only money without the love and intention that had motivated its creation. She would inherit enough to be comfortable, but not enough to feel his presence in her life. It was, Robert realized, exactly what she had claimed to want. The tragedy was that granting her wish would demonstrate just how wrong she had been about his motivations and his love. By the time she understood the difference between wealth given with love and wealth given as obligation, it would be too late to rebuild what her words had destroyed. Robert turned off the study lights and made his way upstairs to his bedroom. The house felt enormous and empty, as it had every night since Diana's death. But tonight the emptiness felt different. Tonight it felt like practice for the emotional distance he was about to create between himself and his only child. Caroline would get her wish. She would be free of any obligation to appreciate or remember him. She would discover what life looked like when the man she claimed had never truly loved her actually stopped trying to show that love in the only ways he knew how. As Robert prepared for bed, he wondered if Caroline would eventually understand what she had thrown away with her cruel words. He suspected she would, but only after it was too late to repair the damage. That realization would be part of her inheritance too, though she didn't know it yet. The next morning dawned gray and cool, with fog rolling in from the Pacific to blanket the Sonoma valleys in ethereal white. Robert woke early, as was his habit, and made his way to the kitchen where Maria was already preparing breakfast. She greeted him with her usual warm smile, but he could see the concern in her eyes. Maria had worked for enough wealthy families to recognize the signs of major life decisions being made. She had seen the legal pads, witnessed the late-night phone calls, observed the subtle changes in routine that indicated significant upheaval ahead. She didn't ask questions, but her gentle attention let Robert know that support was available if he needed it. Over coffee and the morning newspaper, Robert reviewed the notes he had made the previous evening. In the clear light of day, his decision felt even more appropriate. Caroline had drawn a line in their relationship with her cruel words, and Robert was simply acknowledging that line by adjusting his estate planning accordingly. He thought about calling Caroline directly to give her an opportunity to apologize or explain her outburst, but he dismissed the idea almost immediately. Caroline was 34 years old, well past the age where impulsive words could be excused as youthful mistakes. She had meant what she said, or she wouldn't have said it. Giving her a chance to walk it back would only create more confusion and manipulation. Instead, Robert decided to proceed with his legal consultations and let Caroline discover the consequences of her words when his will was eventually read. The delayed revelation would give her time to reflect on their relationship without the immediate pressure of trying to repair damage she might not even recognize she had caused. At exactly 9 o'clock, Robert dialed Margaret Chen's office and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Margaret's assistant noted the urgency in his voice and rearranged her schedule to accommodate him. Margaret had been handling Robert's legal affairs long enough to know that when he requested immediate meetings, significant decisions were involved. The drive to Margaret's San Francisco office took Robert through some of California's most beautiful countryside. Rolling hills covered in oak trees, vineyards stretching to distant mountains, small towns that looked like postcards from a more peaceful era. This landscape represented everything Robert had worked to achieve: beauty, permanence, legacy, stability. But as he drove, Robert realized that landscape only had meaning if someone appreciated it. Caroline had grown up surrounded by this beauty and had apparently seen only the obligations and expectations it represented. She had viewed his efforts to create beauty and security as burdens rather than gifts. Margaret's office occupied the top floor of a building overlooking San Francisco Bay. The view was spectacular, but Robert barely noticed it as he settled into the conference room where he had signed so many important documents over the years. Purchase agreements, investment contracts, estate planning updates, charitable foundation paperwork. This room had been the site of countless decisions designed to benefit Caroline's future. Margaret entered with her usual professional warmth, but Robert could see the concern in her expression. She had been deeply disturbed by Caroline's phone call and its implications for their family relationship. As Robert's legal advisor, Margaret had witnessed the love and care he had put into structuring his estate for Caroline's benefit. She understood how devastating Caroline's words must have been. Robert laid out his decision with characteristic clarity and precision.
He wanted to restructure his will to reflect Caroline's apparent desire for independence from his influence. Caroline would receive a trust fund worth $2 million, enough to ensure basic security, but a small fraction of his total estate. The remainder would be distributed among charities, scholarship funds, and perhaps Maria, who had shown him more genuine appreciation in 3 years than Caroline had in 3 decades. Margaret listened without interruption, taking careful notes. She had handled enough family disputes to understand the emotional dynamics at play. Robert wasn't acting out of spite or anger. He was responding to Caroline's explicit rejection of their relationship by granting her the independence she claimed to want. But Marguerite also had to fulfill her professional obligation to ensure that Robert understood the finality of his decision. Once the new will was executed, there would be no way to communicate his love or disappointment to Caroline. She would simply receive her modest inheritance and discover that the man she had rejected had taken her rejection seriously. Robert confirmed that he understood the implications completely. This wasn't a gesture designed to manipulate Caroline into apologizing or changing her behavior. This was his acknowledgement that their relationship had reached its natural conclusion. Caroline had made her feelings clear, and Robert was responding by restructuring his legacy to reflect those feelings. The conversation took nearly 3 hours as Margaret helped Robert work through the practical details of his decision. Which charities should benefit? How should the trust fund for Caroline be structured? What provisions should be made for Maria, who had become like family during Diana's illness and Robert's widowhood? By the time Robert left Margaret's office, the basic framework of his new will was established. Caroline would receive enough money to live comfortably, but not enough to feel burdened by his legacy. The bulk of his estate would support causes that aligned with values Diana had taught him: education, environmental conservation, support for families facing medical crises. The drive home took Robert through the same beautiful landscape, but now it felt different. Instead of viewing it as Caroline's inheritance, he saw it as a legacy that would benefit people who understood its value. Students who needed scholarship support, conservation groups working to preserve similar landscapes, researchers developing treatments for diseases like the cancer that had taken Diana. Maria greeted him at the front door with her intuitive understanding that something significant had occurred. She didn't ask questions, but she prepared his favorite dinner and created an atmosphere of gentle support throughout the evening. Her presence was a reminder that appreciation and kindness didn't require blood relations. That night, Robert sat in his study making a list of the charitable organizations he wanted to benefit from his estate. Educational foundations that supported first-generation college students, environmental groups working to preserve farmland and open space, medical research organizations focused on cancer treatment and support for families dealing with serious illness. Each organization represented values that Diana had instilled in him and that he had tried to pass on to Caroline. If Caroline couldn't appreciate those values as expressed through his personal love and support, perhaps she would eventually encounter them through the charitable work his estate would fund. The irony was profound. Caroline had accused him of caring more about money than family, but his wealth would now be used exclusively to support other families. She had claimed he was emotionally unavailable, but his estate would fund emotional support services for people facing the kinds of challenges their family had experienced. Robert realized that Caroline would probably never understand the connections between her cruel words and the eventual disposition of his estate. She would receive her modest inheritance, assume he had simply been disappointed in her choices, and never grasp how deeply her rejection had affected his understanding of love, family, and legacy. But understanding wasn't really the point anymore. Robert had spent 34 years trying to help Caroline understand his love in the language of provision and security. She had explicitly rejected that language and demanded that he never use it with her again. So he wouldn't. Instead, he would use his resources to support people who would appreciate them. Caroline would have the independence she claimed to want, and Robert would have the satisfaction of knowing his life's work would benefit people who understood its value. The decision felt both heartbreaking and liberating. Robert grieved for the relationship he had thought he had with Caroline, but he also felt free from the constant burden of trying to prove his love to someone who had decided not to recognize it. Tomorrow would bring the formal process of executing his new estate plan. Tonight, Robert would sit in his study, surrounded by photographs of Caroline at every stage of her life, and he would remember the love he had felt for the daughter who no longer existed, if she ever had. The fog was lifting as Robert prepared for bed, revealing stars that had been hidden all evening. The clearing sky felt symbolic somehow, as if the emotional confusion of recent years was finally giving way to clarity about what really mattered and who truly appreciated the gifts life had to offer. Caroline had wished he had never been born. Soon, from her perspective, he effectively wouldn't have been. She would inherit just enough money to know he had thought of her, but not enough to feel his presence in her life. It was exactly what she had claimed to want, and Robert was finally ready to give it to her. The documents were signed 3 weeks later on a crisp November morning that painted the Sonoma Hills in shades of gold and burgundy. Robert sat across from Margaret Chen's conference table, his signature still drying on papers that would fundamentally alter his family's future. The new will was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Caroline would receive her $2 million trust fund on his death, administered by a neutral third party with strict guidelines preventing any additional distributions. The remaining $35 million would flow to carefully selected charitable organizations. Margaret sealed the original documents in her office safe, and handed Robert copies for his personal files. Her expression carried the weight of professional satisfaction mixed with personal sadness. She had known the Kellerman family for over 20 years and had witnessed the gradual deterioration of Robert and Caroline's relationship with growing concern. But she also understood that Robert's decision represented clarity rather than cruelty. The drive home took Robert through downtown Healdsburg, where early Christmas decorations were already appearing in shop windows. The seasonal displays seemed premature given that Thanksgiving was still 2 weeks away, but Robert found their optimistic cheerfulness oddly comforting. Life continued its normal rhythms regardless of personal upheavals and family tragedies.
Maria was waiting when he arrived home, having prepared lunch and arranged fresh flowers throughout the house. Her intuitive understanding of his moods had become invaluable during the weeks of legal consultations and emotional processing. She sensed that today marked the completion of something significant, though she still didn't know the specific details of his decisions. Robert spent the afternoon in his study, filing the estate documents in his personal safe alongside other important papers. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, Diana's death certificate, investment records, property deeds. The accumulated paperwork of a well-lived life now reorganized to reflect new priorities and different definitions of family loyalty. The irony wasn't lost on him that Caroline had always criticized his attention to financial details and legal documentation. She had viewed his careful record-keeping as evidence of misplaced priorities, claiming that he cared more about paperwork than people. Now, that same attention to detail would ensure that her inheritance reflected exactly the level of emotional connection she had declared between them. His phone rang at 4:30, interrupting his contemplation. The caller ID showed a Portland number that Robert didn't immediately recognize, though something about it seemed familiar. He answered with his usual professional greeting, expecting perhaps a business call or charity solicitation. Instead, he heard Caroline's voice for the first time since Margaret's disturbing phone call 3 weeks earlier. But this Caroline sounded different. Gone was the angry, accusatory tone he had grown accustomed to during the recent conversations. Instead, she sounded tired and uncertain, as if she were calling from a place of confusion rather than rage. Caroline explained that she had been thinking about their relationship lately, particularly since her conversation with Margaret Chen. She had been drinking that night, she admitted, and was embarrassed by some of the things she had said. She wasn't calling to apologize exactly, but she wanted to understand why Robert's attorney had been so cold and dismissive during their conversation. Robert listened carefully, noting that Caroline's version of events differed significantly from Margaret's account. Caroline claimed she had simply been asking reasonable questions about estate planning and family financial security. She made no mention of the cruel words that had prompted Robert's decision to restructure his will. Either she genuinely didn't remember what she had said, or she was hoping he hadn't been told about it. The conversation that followed was surreal in its superficial normalcy. Caroline asked about his health, mentioned that business was going well in Portland, and suggested they might arrange a visit sometime soon. She spoke as if their relationship existed in the same state it had before her drunken call to Margaret, as if words once spoken could simply be forgotten without consequence. Robert found himself responding with equal superficiality, discussing the weather and vineyard conditions while mentally calculating how much Caroline's trust fund would generate in annual income. Approximately $80,000 per year, assuming conservative investment management. Enough to supplement her architectural practice, but not enough to replace the need for actual work and financial responsibility. When Caroline mentioned possibly visiting for Thanksgiving, Robert experienced a moment of cognitive dissonance so profound that he had to sit down. Here was his daughter, casually planning family holidays while apparently oblivious to the fact that she had effectively ended their meaningful relationship 3 weeks earlier, with words so cruel that they had prompted him to restructure his entire estate. The disconnect was breathtaking. Caroline seemed to believe that family relationships could absorb unlimited emotional damage without consequence, that love could survive any level of rejection and abuse simply because it was family love. She appeared to have no understanding that her words had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, had broken things that couldn't be repaired. Robert found himself agreeing to Thanksgiving dinner plans while simultaneously knowing that he would be hosting a daughter who had wished him dead. The holiday would be performed rather than celebrated, a charade of family harmony overlaying the reality of fundamental disconnection. But perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps Caroline deserved the opportunity to experience normal family interactions one last time before discovering what her words had actually cost her. After ending the call, Robert sat in his study as evening shadows lengthened across the vineyard. Caroline's casual dismissal of her own cruelty was almost more disturbing than the original words had been. It suggested a level of emotional disconnection that Robert hadn't fully appreciated before. Caroline wasn't just angry or hurt, she was fundamentally unable to recognize the impact of her behavior on other people. The realization was both illuminating and heartbreaking. Robert had spent years trying to bridge the communication gap between them, assuming that better understanding would lead to improved relationships. But Caroline's phone call suggested that the problem wasn't miscommunication. The problem was Caroline's apparent inability to comprehend that other people's feelings mattered as much as her own. Maria appeared in the doorway with tea and cookies, her presence once again providing exactly the right amount of supportive attention. She had overheard enough of his conversation to understand that Caroline would be visiting for Thanksgiving, and her expression showed concern rather than pleasure at the prospect. Maria had witnessed the aftermath of too many difficult phone calls with Caroline to view her visits as purely positive events. Robert accepted the tea gratefully and settled into his reading chair. The familiar ritual was grounding after the emotional whiplash of Caroline's call. Her apparent amnesia about their relationship's current state would make Thanksgiving dinner even more complex than he had anticipated. She would arrive expecting normal family interactions, while Robert would be hosting someone who had explicitly wished for his death. The holiday would be performed rather than celebrated, a charade of family harmony overlaying the reality of fundamental disconnection. But perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps Caroline deserved the opportunity to experience normal family interactions one last time before discovering what her words had actually cost her. After ending the call, Robert sat in his study as evening shadows lengthened across the vineyard. Caroline's casual dismissal of her own cruelty was almost more disturbing than the original words had been. It suggested a level of emotional disconnection that Robert hadn't fully appreciated before. Caroline wasn't just angry or hurt, she was fundamentally unable to recognize the impact of her behavior on other people. The realization was both illuminating and heartbreaking. Robert had spent years trying to bridge the communication gap between them, assuming that better understanding would lead to improved relationships. But Caroline's phone call suggested that the problem wasn't miscommunication. The problem was Caroline's apparent inability to comprehend that other people's feelings mattered as much as her own. Maria appeared in the doorway with tea and cookies, her presence once again providing exactly the right amount of supportive attention. She had overheard enough of his conversation to understand that Caroline would be visiting for Thanksgiving, and her expression showed concern rather than pleasure at the prospect. Maria had witnessed the aftermath of too many difficult phone calls with Caroline to view her visits as purely positive events. Robert accepted the tea gratefully and settled into his reading chair. The familiar ritual was grounding after the emotional whiplash of Caroline's call. Her apparent amnesia about their relationship's current state would make Thanksgiving dinner even more complex than he had anticipated. She would arrive expecting normal family interactions, while Robert would be hosting someone who had explicitly wished for his death. The holiday would be performed rather than celebrated, a charade of family harmony overlaying the reality of fundamental disconnection. But perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps Caroline deserved the opportunity to experience normal family interactions one last time before discovering what her words had actually cost her. After ending the call, Robert sat in his study as evening shadows lengthened across the vineyard. Caroline's casual dismissal of her own cruelty was almost more disturbing than the original words had been. It suggested a level of emotional disconnection that Robert hadn't fully appreciated before. Caroline wasn't just angry or hurt, she was fundamentally unable to recognize the impact of her behavior on other people.
The realization was both illuminating and heartbreaking. Robert had spent years trying to bridge the communication gap between them, assuming that better understanding would lead to improved relationships. But Caroline's phone call suggested that the problem wasn't miscommunication. The problem was Caroline's apparent inability to comprehend that other people's feelings mattered as much as her own. Maria appeared in the doorway with tea and cookies, her presence once again providing exactly the right amount of supportive attention. She had overheard enough of his conversation to understand that Caroline would be visiting for Thanksgiving, and her expression showed concern rather than pleasure at the prospect. Maria had witnessed the aftermath of too many difficult phone calls with Caroline to view her visits as purely positive events. Robert accepted the tea gratefully and settled into his reading chair. The familiar ritual was grounding after the emotional whiplash of Caroline's call. Her apparent amnesia about their relationship's current state would make Thanksgiving dinner even more complex than he had anticipated. She would arrive expecting normal family interactions, while Robert would be hosting someone who had explicitly wished for his death. The next few weeks passed in a strange suspension of normal time. Robert went through the motions of Thanksgiving preparation, while Maria handled the practical details of menu planning and house cleaning. He arranged for Caroline's favorite foods to be prepared and her childhood bedroom to be ready for her visit. The preparations felt like elaborate theater, staging a performance of family love for an audience of one who wouldn't appreciate.
Either she was psychologically unable to acknowledge what she had said, or she was hoping that Robert hadn't been informed about it and was attempting to return their relationship to its previous state without addressing her outburst. Both possibilities were disturbing in different ways. Robert found himself looking forward to Thanksgiving dinner with the same anticipation he might feel before a dental procedure. Necessary, unavoidable, and likely to be uncomfortable despite everyone's best efforts, but also potentially illuminating. Caroline's behavior during the visit would reveal whether her recent phone calls represented genuine confusion or strategic amnesia. Maria prepared for Caroline's arrival with professional efficiency tinged with personal concern. She had never met Robert's daughter directly, but she had observed the emotional toll their relationship took on Robert. Maria's own family relationships were warm and supportive, making Caroline's treatment of her father particularly difficult for her to understand. The guest bedroom was prepared with fresh linens and flowers from the garden. Caroline's favorite foods were planned and partially prepared. The house was cleaned and organized to create an atmosphere of welcoming warmth. Robert appreciated Maria's efforts while recognizing the irony that she was working to create comfort for someone who had caused him such profound pain. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Robert received an unexpected call from his financial advisor requesting an urgent meeting. Thomas Morrison had been managing Robert's investment portfolio for 15 years and was not prone to unnecessary drama or emergency consultations. His request for immediate attention suggested that something significant had occurred in Robert's financial affairs. The meeting took place in Thomas's downtown office, which offered spectacular views of San Francisco Bay. Thomas was clearly agitated about something, though he maintained his usual professional demeanor while explaining the situation. He had received several phone calls over the past week from someone claiming to represent Caroline's interests in Robert's estate planning. The caller had demanded detailed information about Robert's investment accounts, real estate holdings, and overall net worth. When Thomas had declined to provide such confidential information without proper authorization, the caller had become increasingly aggressive and threatening. They had claimed that Caroline had power of attorney over Robert's affairs and insisted that Thomas was legally required to provide complete financial disclosure. But Thomas's investigation had revealed no such power of attorney documentation in Robert's files. Moreover, the caller's questions suggested an unrealistic understanding of both estate law and financial management. They seemed to believe that adult children automatically had access to their parents' financial information and inheritance rights that didn't actually exist under California law. Robert listened to Thomas's account with growing unease. The pattern was disturbingly similar to Caroline's call to Margaret Chen, but with an escalation that suggested more serious intent. Someone was actively researching his financial affairs and making legal claims that had no basis in reality. The timing, coming just days before Carolyn's Thanksgiving visit, seemed unlikely to be coincidental. Thomas recommended increased security measures for Robert's accounts and suggested that they review all existing legal documentation to ensure that Carolyn had no unauthorized access to sensitive information. He also proposed involving law enforcement if the harassing phone calls continued, as they might constitute attempted fraud or elder abuse under California statutes. The conversation lasted over 2 hours as Thomas walked Robert through various scenarios and protective measures. By the time Robert left the office, he had authorized additional security protocols and had begun to understand that Carolyn's interest in his estate might be more immediate and aggressive than he had realized. The drive home through rush-hour traffic gave Robert time to process the implications of Thomas's revelations. Carolyn's casual phone calls about Thanksgiving dinner took on a different meaning when viewed alongside her apparent investigation of his financial affairs. Perhaps her visit wasn't motivated by family sentiment at all. Perhaps she was conducting reconnaissance for more serious future actions. That evening, Robert called Margaret Chen to inform her about the calls to Thomas Morrison. Margaret listened with professional concern and immediately began outlining additional legal protections they should implement. She recommended updating all account authorizations to explicitly exclude Carolyn from any access, and she suggested documenting the pattern of intrusive behavior in case future legal action became necessary. Margaret also raised the possibility that Carolyn might be planning some kind of competency challenge similar to the recent case they had handled for another client. If Carolyn believed Robert was mentally declining, she might be positioning herself to claim guardianship over his affairs. The financial investigation could be preparation for such a legal challenge. Robert found the idea both absurd and terrifying. He was 68 years old and in excellent physical and mental health. His business judgment remained sharp, his investment portfolio was well managed, and his daily activities showed no signs of cognitive decline. But he had seen enough elder abuse cases to know that determined adult children could manufacture evidence of incompetency with the right legal representation. The irony was devastating. Carolyn had accused him of caring more about money than family, but her own behavior suggested that she was primarily interested in his wealth rather than their relationship. Her investigation of his finances, combined with her apparent amnesia about their recent conflicts, painted a picture of someone who viewed him as a financial resource rather than a father. That night, Robert sat in his study reviewing all of his legal and financial documents with new eyes. Every account, every asset, every legal arrangement was suddenly viewed through the lens of potential misuse by someone who had legal standing as his only heir, but who had demonstrated neither affection nor respect for his well-being. The estate planning documents he had signed 3 weeks earlier took on additional significance in this context. By limiting Carolyn's inheritance to a modest trust fund, he had protected the bulk of his assets from potential mismanagement or abuse. But the emotional cost of these revelations was enormous. Robert had restructured his estate in response to Carolyn's cruel words, but he had still maintained some hope that their relationship might eventually heal. The evidence of her financial investigation suggested that healing was impossible because Carolyn viewed him primarily as a source of wealth rather than a person deserving of love and respect. Maria knocked softly on the study door and entered with hot chocolate and homemade cookies. Her timing was perfect as always, providing comfort exactly when it was needed most. She had become skilled at reading Robert's moods and offering appropriate support without requiring detailed explanations of his troubles. Robert accepted the hot chocolate gratefully and invited Maria to sit with him while he processed the day's revelations. Her presence was calming and genuine, a stark contrast to Carolyn's apparent manipulation and calculation. Maria cared about his well-being without any ulterior motives or hidden agendas. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest Robert had engaged in since Diana's death. Maria had witnessed enough of his interactions with Carolyn to understand the basic dynamics of their relationship, and she had formed her own opinions about Carolyn's character based on those observations. Her perspective was both compassionate and realistic, acknowledging Robert's love for his daughter while recognizing Caroline's apparent inability to reciprocate that love appropriately. Maria suggested that Robert might want to reconsider Caroline's Thanksgiving visit given the new information about financial investigations and potential legal challenges. She pointed out that having Caroline in the house might provide her with opportunities to gather additional information or create situations that could later be misrepresented. But Robert decided to proceed with the planned visit. Caroline's behavior during Thanksgiving dinner would provide valuable insight into her actual motivations and future intentions. If she was indeed planning some kind of legal or financial challenge, it would be better to understand her strategy sooner rather than later. The next morning brought another call from Thomas Morrison with additional disturbing news. His security review had revealed that someone had attempted to access Robert's accounts online using passwords that suggested inside knowledge of his personal information. The attempts had been unsuccessful due to recent security upgrades, but they indicated a level of preparation and intent that went far beyond casual curiosity. Thomas recommended that Robert consider hiring private security for his property and personal protection. The pattern of behavior suggested that Caroline, or someone working with her, was conducting a sophisticated investigation of his affairs with potentially criminal intent. Elder financial abuse was a serious crime in California, and the evidence was mounting that Robert might be targeted for such abuse. Robert agreed to the security recommendations while privately marveling at the surreal nature of his situation. 3 weeks earlier, he had been a father grieving for a damaged relationship with his daughter. Now he was a potential victim of financial crimes being planned by that same daughter. The transformation was so complete and so devastating that Robert struggled to process its emotional implications. How had Caroline's rejection of his love evolved into apparent criminal planning? When had their family relationship become a predatory scheme? How had he failed so completely to understand his daughter's true character? These questions haunted Robert as he prepared for Caroline's arrival the following day. Thanksgiving dinner would no longer be a family reunion or even a difficult conversation about their relationship. It would be a strategic encounter between a father who had restructured his estate and a daughter who might be planning to steal what remained. The irony was profound and heartbreaking. Caroline had criticized Robert for prioritizing financial security over emotional connection. Now she was demonstrating that her own priorities lay entirely with financial gain rather than family love. Her accusations had been projection rather than insight, revealing her own character rather than his failings. That evening, Robert walked through his vineyard as the sun set behind the western hills. The landscape that had always represented peace and permanence now felt vulnerable and temporary. Caroline's visit would bring uncertainty and potential danger into his sanctuary. The home he had built as a legacy for her would now need to be protected from her. The vines were dormant for winter, their bare branches stark against the evening sky. But beneath the surface, roots remained strong and deep, preparing for spring growth and future harvests. Robert found the metaphor both comforting and instructive. His love for Caroline might be dormant now, damaged by her betrayal and manipulation, but its roots ran deep enough to survive whatever challenges lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring Caroline's arrival and the beginning of whatever plans she had developed. Robert would host Thanksgiving dinner for a daughter who had wished him dead and who might be actively planning to defraud him. But he would do so with complete legal protection and clear understanding of the stakes involved. The estate documents locked in Margaret Chen's safe would ensure that Caroline's schemes would ultimately fail. The security measures Thomas Morrison had implemented would protect Robert's current assets from unauthorized access. The documentation of Caroline's behavior would provide evidence if legal action became necessary. But none of these protections could repair the fundamental damage to their relationship. Caroline had revealed herself to be someone who viewed her father as a financial target rather than a family member deserving of love and respect. That revelation couldn't be undone, regardless of how successfully Robert protected himself from its consequences. As Robert returned to the house, he felt the weight of completed preparation. His legal affairs were in order, his financial assets were protected, and his emotional expectations were appropriately calibrated.
Caroline would arrive tomorrow expecting to find a vulnerable elderly man she could manipulate and potentially defraud. Instead, she would encounter a father who understood exactly who she had become and who had taken appropriate measures to protect himself from her true intentions. The next 24 hours would determine whether Caroline's visit represented a final opportunity for honest communication or the opening move in a more serious conflict. Robert was prepared for either possibility, though he privately hoped for outcomes that seemed increasingly unlikely given the evidence of her recent behavior. Maria served him a light dinner and wished him a peaceful evening, her concern evident but unspoken. She would be present during Caroline's visit, providing both practical support and witness testimony if needed. Her loyalty and genuine affection had become invaluable during this period of family betrayal and uncertainty. Robert spent his final evening alone, reviewing family photographs and remembering better times, when Caroline's love had seemed genuine and her future had appeared bright with promise. Those memories felt like artifacts from a different life, preserved but no longer relevant to current reality. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter in their relationship, one defined by legal protections and strategic caution rather than parental love and trust. The preparation was complete. The trap, if that's what Caroline was walking into, was set with precision and care. Robert would discover soon enough whether his daughter was coming home for Thanksgiving dinner or arriving to implement a plan that would transform their family conflict into criminal behavior. Either way, he was ready to respond appropriately and protect everything that truly mattered to him. Caroline's rental car pulled into the circular driveway at exactly 2 o'clock on Thanksgiving afternoon. She emerged looking polished and confident, wearing a burgundy sweater and dark jeans that conveyed casual sophistication. Her auburn hair caught the November sunlight as she retrieved a small suitcase and leather portfolio from the back seat. The portfolio struck Robert as an odd choice for a family holiday visit. Maria greeted Caroline at the front door with professional warmth, introducing herself as Robert's housekeeper and companion. Caroline's response was pleasant but calculating, her eyes already scanning the foyer and visible portions of the house with an appraiser's attention to detail. She complimented the fresh flower arrangements while mentally cataloging artwork and antiques that hadn't been present during her previous visits.
Robert appeared in the doorway of his study, observing the interaction between Caroline and Maria with new awareness of underlying dynamics. Caroline's smile when she saw him was bright and seemingly genuine, but he noticed that her eyes remained watchful and analytical. She approached him for a hug that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, her embrace lasting exactly the right amount of time to appear affectionate without conveying actual warmth. The conversation that followed over coffee in the living room was a masterpiece of surface-level pleasantness overlaying deeper currents of tension and calculation. Caroline asked about Robert's health with apparent concern while subtly probing for information about his daily routines, medical appointments, and any signs of cognitive decline. She mentioned her architectural practice in Portland with enthusiasm while steering the conversation toward Robert's business affairs and investment strategies. Robert responded to her questions with equal subtlety, providing general information while avoiding specific details about his financial situation or estate planning. He complimented her apparent business success while privately noting that her designer clothing and expensive accessories suggested income levels that seemed inconsistent with a struggling architectural practice. Either her business was more successful than she had indicated, or she had access to funding sources she hadn't mentioned. Caroline produced her leather portfolio during their conversation, revealing architectural drawings and project photographs that she claimed to want to share with Robert. But as she spread the materials across the coffee table, her positioning allowed her to photograph sections of the living room with her phone under the pretense of documenting their conversation. The behavior was so subtle that someone less suspicious might have missed it entirely. The portfolio itself was impressive, featuring innovative designs for sustainable housing and commercial buildings that demonstrated genuine talent and creativity. Caroline's passion for environmental architecture seemed authentic, making her apparent financial scheming even more disappointing. She possessed legitimate skills and promising career prospects that should have made manipulation and fraud unnecessary. During their discussion of her work, Caroline casually mentioned recent conversations with potential investors who were interested in funding larger projects. She described these investors in vague terms that suggested significant wealth and sophisticated understanding of complex financial arrangements. Robert wondered whether these mysterious investors were real, or whether Caroline was attempting to create an impression of financial sophistication that might make him more likely to discuss his own investments. Maria served an elegant lunch featuring Caroline's favorite dishes from childhood, creating an atmosphere of nostalgic family warmth that felt increasingly surreal given the underlying tensions. Caroline praised Maria's cooking effusively while continuing to photograph the dining room and its contents under various pretexts. Her behavior suggested someone conducting detailed documentation rather than someone enjoying a family reunion. The afternoon conversation covered safer topics like local wine country events, Caroline's travel experiences, and mutual acquaintances from their shared past. But Robert noticed that Caroline consistently steered discussions back toward financial themes: the cost of maintaining the estate, Robert's plans for retirement, his thoughts about legacy planning, and charitable giving. Her interest in these topics seemed far more intense than casual family conversation would warrant. When Caroline excused herself to freshen up before dinner, Robert and Maria exchanged meaningful glances that confirmed they had both observed her unusual behavior. Maria's expression conveyed concern and disapproval, while Robert's nod indicated that Caroline's actions were consistent with his expectations based on recent events. The pretense of normal family interaction was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Caroline's exploration of the house during her supposed bathroom break lasted nearly 30 minutes, long enough to conduct thorough reconnaissance of room layouts, security systems, and valuable items. When she returned, she commented knowledgeably about architectural details and design choices that she couldn't have remembered from childhood visits, suggesting that her current tour had been more comprehensive than casual nostalgia would require. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, with Maria's exceptional cooking creating a feast worthy of the best restaurants. Caroline's appreciation seemed genuine, and for brief moments the conversation achieved something approaching normal family warmth. She shared amusing stories from her Portland social life and asked thoughtful questions about Robert's vineyard management and wine production. But even during these more relaxed exchanges, her eyes continued to catalog details about the house's contents and layout. The evening's most revealing moment came when Caroline suggested they take coffee in Robert's study, claiming she wanted to see his library and art collection. Her request was reasonable and innocent-sounding, but Robert recognized it as an attempt to access the room where he conducted his most sensitive business affairs. He agreed while mentally reviewing what confidential materials might be visible to a trained observer. Caroline's examination of the study was systematic and thorough, disguised as admiration for Robert's book collection and family photographs. She asked probing questions about his computer setup, file storage systems, and daily work routines while praising his organizational skills and attention to detail. Her behavior suggested someone gathering intelligence rather than someone enjoying family memorabilia. But Caroline's most significant mistake came when she asked to use Robert's computer to show him her firm's website, claiming that her phone's screen was too small to properly display her recent projects. Robert agreed while privately activating security protocols that would monitor any attempt to access unauthorized files or accounts. Caroline's computer usage revealed sophisticated knowledge of financial software and database management that seemed inconsistent with her claimed focus on architectural design. The computer monitoring revealed that Caroline had attempted to access Robert's email accounts, investment platforms, and legal document storage systems during the few minutes she supposedly showing him her website. Her password attempts suggested inside knowledge of his personal information, including dates and names that should have been private. The evidence of attempted unauthorized access was clear and legally significant. Robert maintained his composure while internally processing the implications of Caroline's behavior.
Her Thanksgiving visit was indeed reconnaissance for a larger scheme, probably involving identity theft, financial fraud, or a competency challenge that would require detailed knowledge of her daily routines and business affairs. Her apparent amnesia about their recent conflicts now seemed like calculated manipulation rather than genuine confusion. The evening concluded with Caroline expressing gratitude for the wonderful dinner and her excitement about spending more time together during her extended weekend visit. She mentioned wanting to explore the vineyard property the next morning and suggested they might visit some of her favorite local restaurants during her stay. Her enthusiasm seemed manufactured rather than genuine, designed to extend her access to his home and personal information. After Caroline retired to her guest room, Robert and Maria conducted a quiet debriefing in the kitchen while cleaning up from dinner. Maria confirmed that she had observed Caroline's suspicious behavior throughout the day, including the photography, the extended house exploration, and the obvious attempts to gather information about Robert's routines and security measures. Her professional experience with other wealthy families had taught her to recognize the signs of potential exploitation. Robert shared the computer monitoring results with Maria, explaining that Caroline had attempted to access sensitive accounts and files during her supposed website demonstration. The evidence was conclusive that Caroline's visit involved criminal intent rather than family reconciliation. Maria's reaction was protective and angry, her maternal instincts aroused by the threat to someone she had come to care about deeply. They agreed that Caroline's visit should be terminated as soon as possible, but in a way that didn't alert her to her true intentions. Robert would manufacture a plausible excuse for cutting her visit short while ensuring that law enforcement was notified about the attempted computer intrusions and other suspicious behavior. Maria would document everything she had observed for potential legal proceedings. That night, Robert lay awake processing the emotional implications of Caroline's betrayal alongside the practical considerations of protecting himself from her schemes. The daughter he'd loved and provided for had transformed into someone who viewed him as a criminal target rather than family. The reality was so devastating that he struggled to accept its completeness despite the overwhelming evidence. But Caroline's behavior had also provided clarity about his estate planning decisions. His instinct to limit her inheritance had been prescient rather than punitive. Someone willing to commit fraud and identity theft against her own father was not someone who deserves to inherit significant wealth or responsibility.
His restructured will would protect both his assets and Caroline herself from the consequences of managing wealth she hadn't earned and didn't appreciate. The next morning brought coffee and conversation that felt like performance art, with both Robert and Caroline maintaining facades of family warmth while pursuing very different agendas. Caroline continued her information gathering with subtle questions about Robert's investment advisors, legal representatives, and banking relationships. Robert provided misleading information designed to frustrate any future fraud attempts while appearing cooperative and trusting. Caroline's suggestion that they tour the vineyard property together provided an opportunity for Robert to test his theories about her intentions. He agreed enthusiastically while privately arranging for additional security monitoring of the house during their absence. If Caroline was working with accomplices, their tour might provide cover for more serious criminal activity. The vineyard tour revealed Caroline's complete lack of genuine interest in Robert's agricultural achievements or environmental stewardship efforts. Her questions focused exclusively on property values, development potential, and the mechanics of estate transfer after death. She showed no appreciation for the decades of careful cultivation that had created one of Sonoma County's most respected wine properties. But the tour also provided Robert with an opportunity to observe Caroline's phone usage and communication patterns. She sent numerous text messages during their walk, often stepping away to make brief phone calls that she claimed were work-related. Her body language during these communications suggested coordination with other parties rather than routine business conversations. When they returned to the house, Robert discovered that his suspicions about accomplices had been justified. Maria reported that someone had attempted to enter the property during their absence, triggering security alarms that had frightened the intruder away before any actual break-in occurred. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Caroline's vineyard tour had been designed to provide cover for more serious criminal activity. Robert's response was swift and decisive. He informed Caroline that urgent business matters required him to travel to San Francisco immediately, cutting her visit short by 2 days. He offered to arrange alternative accommodation if she wanted to extend her wine country vacation, but he needed her to vacate the guest room that afternoon. His tone was apologetic but firm, leaving no room for negotiation. Caroline's reaction revealed the depth of her frustration with the abbreviated visit. Her disappointment seemed far more intense than the situation warranted, suggesting that she had planned additional reconnaissance or criminal activity that would now be impossible. She accepted Robert's explanation with surface grace, while her eyes showed calculation and anger that she couldn't entirely conceal. The drive to Caroline's hotel in downtown Healdsburg provided their final private conversation, and Robert used the opportunity to deliver a carefully crafted message. He mentioned casually that he had recently updated his estate planning and security arrangements on the advice of his legal and financial advisors. He didn't provide specific details, but he wanted Caroline to understand that her potential targets were now protected against the kind of schemes she appeared to be planning. Caroline's response was telling. Instead of showing normal curiosity about family financial planning, she demonstrated detailed knowledge of estate law and inheritance procedures that seemed far beyond what an architect would typically know. Her questions were sophisticated and pointed, revealing familiarity with legal strategies for challenging wills and claiming elder abuse. The conversation confirmed that Caroline had been researching more than just Robert's current financial situation. At the hotel, Caroline's farewell was overly affectionate in a way that felt manipulative rather than loving. She spoke enthusiastically about future visits and family traditions, while her behavior suggested someone saying goodbye to a target rather than a father. Robert reciprocated her emotional display, while privately recognizing it as the end of any meaningful father-daughter relationship they might have had. The drive home took Robert through familiar wine country landscape that now felt different after Caroline's visit. The beauty remained unchanged, but his perception of it had been altered by the realization that his own daughter viewed his life's work as nothing more than potential financial gain. The legacy he had built for her had become the weapon she planned to use against him. That evening, Robert called Margaret Chen to report Caroline's attempted computer intrusions and the coordinated break-in attempt. Margaret listened with professional concern and immediately began outlining legal responses that would protect Robert while documenting Caroline's criminal behavior. She recommended involving law enforcement and suggested that Robert consider seeking a restraining order if Caroline's harassment continued. Margaret also confirmed that Robert's recently updated will provided excellent protection against the kind of financial manipulation Caroline appeared to be planning. Even if she succeeded in some kind of competency challenge, the bulk of his estate was now protected by irrevocable trusts and charitable commitments that couldn't be altered by guardianship proceedings. Caroline's schemes would ultimately gain her nothing more than the modest inheritance Robert had specifically designated for her. The conversation with Margaret provided both legal protection and emotional validation. Robert's instincts about Caroline's character had been accurate, and his estate planning decisions had been prescient rather than punitive. Someone willing to commit fraud against her own father was not someone who deserved to inherit significant wealth or responsibility. Over the following weeks, Robert received several voicemails from Caroline that demonstrated the evolution of her strategy. Initial messages thanked him for the wonderful Thanksgiving visit and suggested plans for Christmas celebrations. But as time passed without response, her tone became increasingly demanding and accusatory. She complained about feeling shut out of his life and demanded more frequent communication and financial transparency. The progression was textbook manipulation, designed to create guilt and obligation that would make Robert more susceptible to future exploitation. But her approach revealed fundamental misunderstanding of his character and current emotional state. Caroline seemed to believe that family obligation would override his awareness of her criminal intentions. She apparently couldn't comprehend that trust, once broken by fraud attempts, couldn't be restored through manipulation and emotional pressure. Caroline's final voicemail was the most revealing of all. Frustrated by Robert's lack of response to her previous messages, she abandoned all pretense of family affection and demanded immediate information about his estate planning and financial situation.
She claimed that she had legal rights to such information as his only heir and threatened to involve lawyers if he continued to be unreasonable and secretive about family finances. The message provided perfect documentation of her true motives and character. Her mask of loving daughter had been completely discarded in favor of the demanding potential heir who viewed Robert's wealth as her rightful property. The transformation was so complete that Robert wondered whether any genuine affection had ever existed behind Caroline's calculated expressions of family love. Robert's was silence. Caroline's threats and demands deserved no acknowledgement because they had no basis in law or morality. Adult children had no automatic rights to their parents' financial information or estate planning decisions. Caroline's angry voicemails simply provided additional evidence of her inappropriate sense of entitlements and willingness to use intimidation to achieve her goals. But Robert did take practical action based on Caroline's escalating harassment. He engaged a private security firm to monitor his property and personal safety, recognizing that someone willing to commit fraud might escalate to more serious criminal activity when their initial schemes failed.
He also arranged for additional legal documentation of Caroline's threatening communications, creating a comprehensive record that would support future restraining orders or criminal charges if necessary. The holiday season proceeded without Caroline's participation, and Robert discovered that Christmas morning felt more peaceful than any recent holiday. Maria prepared a quiet celebration that focused on gratitude rather than obligation, appreciation rather than expectation. The absence of Caroline's manipulative presence allowed Robert to remember what family celebrations could be like when genuine affection replaced calculated performance. Maria's own family joined them for Christmas dinner, bringing warmth and laughter that reminded Robert of what healthy family relationships looked like. Maria's adult children and grandchildren treated Robert with natural respect and affection, asking thoughtful questions about his interests and sharing stories from their own lives. The contrast with Caroline's behavior was stark and illuminating. During the quiet week between Christmas and New Year's Day, Robert reflected on the year's revelations and decisions. Caroline's cruel words had prompted him to restructure his estate, protecting his assets from someone who had proven herself unworthy of inheriting them. Her subsequent criminal behavior had confirmed the wisdom of his decision while revealing the depth of her character flaws. But the year had also brought unexpected gifts in the form of Maria's loyalty and affection, Margaret Chen's professional protection, and Thomas Morrison's financial security measures. People who weren't blood relatives had demonstrated more genuine care for Robert's well-being than his own daughter had shown. The lesson was both heartbreaking and liberating. Robert's New Year's resolution was simple: to stop grieving for relationships that had never truly existed and to appreciate the genuine connections that had developed in their place. Caroline had revealed herself to be someone who viewed him as a financial target rather than a beloved parent. That revelation was devastating but also clarifying. He would no longer waste emotional energy trying to rebuild a relationship with someone who had never shared his understanding of love, loyalty, and family obligation. The legal protections were in place, the estate planning was complete, the security measures were implemented. Caroline would receive her modest inheritance when the time came, but she would never again have access to Robert's love, trust, or resources. She had chosen her priorities clearly, and Robert had responded by restructuring his legacy to reflect those priorities. Winter in Sonoma County brought dormant vines and peaceful mornings that allowed Robert to appreciate the beauty he had created without the burden of sharing it with someone who couldn't see its value. Caroline had accused him of caring more about money than family, but her own behavior had demonstrated that she was the one who viewed relationships primarily through financial lenses. The irony was profound and permanent. Caroline had gotten exactly what she claimed to want: freedom from her father's influence and independence from his expectations. But she had also lost access to the love and legacy she had apparently never valued anyway. Her inheritance would be sufficient for basic security, but insufficient for the lifestyle she seemed to expect. And the emotional support she had rejected would never be offered again. Maria continued to provide the kind of appreciation and companionship that made Robert's daily life rich and meaningful. Her presence was a constant reminder that genuine affection was possible between people who shared values of respect, loyalty, and mutual care. Caroline's absence, by contrast, eliminated a source of constant tension and disappointment that had poisoned family gatherings for years. Robert's vineyard flourished under his continued careful management, its dormant vines preparing for another year of growth and production. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. Some relationships, like damaged vines, needed to be pruned away to allow healthy growth to continue. Caroline had pruned herself from his life through her cruel words and criminal behavior, leaving room for relationships based on genuine appreciation rather than entitled expectation. The final resolution came in late January when Margaret Chen called to inform Robert that Caroline had retained a Portland attorney to challenge his estate planning and demand financial disclosure. The challenge had no legal merit and would ultimately fail, but it provided conclusive evidence of Caroline's true priorities and character. She was indeed willing to pursue litigation against her own father in pursuit of wealth she hadn't earned and didn't deserve. Robert's response was instructive. Instead of anger or hurt, he felt relief that Caroline's true nature had been fully revealed and legally documented. Her frivolous lawsuit would cost her significant legal fees while accomplishing nothing except proving his judgment about her character had been accurate. The modest inheritance she would eventually receive would be reduced by her own legal expenses, providing perfect poetic justice for her greedy manipulation. The lawsuit also triggered additional legal protections that would prevent any future harassment or fraud attempts. Caroline's aggressive legal strategy had backfired spectacularly, providing Robert with comprehensive protection while destroying any remaining pretense of family relationship. She had chosen money over love so clearly that even she couldn't deny the priorities her actions revealed. Spring arrived early in wine country, bringing new growth to Robert's carefully tended vines and new appreciation for relationships based on genuine rather than calculated affection. Caroline's absence from his life felt like recovery from a long illness, allowing him to recognize health he hadn't realized he was missing. Maria's loyal presence and Margaret's professional protection provided the kind of security and care that Caroline's manipulative love had never offered. The estate documents remained safely secured in Margaret's office, protecting Robert's life's work from someone who had proven herself unworthy of inheriting them. Caroline would receive exactly what her behavior had earned, enough money to be comfortable, but not enough to feel his continuing presence in her life. It was perfect justice, delivered with precision and finality. Robert's final reflection on their relationship was both sorrowful and peaceful. He had loved Caroline completely and provided for her generously, but she had chosen to interpret his love as manipulation and his provision as control. Her rejection of his affection had freed him to redirect both his emotional energy and his financial legacy toward people and causes that would appreciate them properly. Caroline had wished he had never been born. Through his estate planning, Robert had granted her wish as completely as possible. From her perspective, his meaningful presence in her life had indeed ended, replaced by the minimal inheritance she had earned through her cruel words and criminal behavior. She would discover too late what she had thrown away, but that discovery would be her burden to bear alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.